How's it going? I'm Dominic. This is Autotroph. I haven't been regular on YouTube for about 8 years, but here we are. There's a bus going by. I decided to record out here because the sun is really nice and the lighting's really good, and I don't want to be in my dank crypt of a bedroom because I've been in there editing for the last 3-4 days, full all-nighters in some cases. So I'm looking forward to some at least outside adjacent time. So yeah, essentially I'm bringing this channel back and I want to talk about video games. I think they're important. I think they are more important than some people think in terms of their contribution to art and society. Hi, baby. So yeah, the plan's to talk about games. We're gonna start with a small one, Baldur's Gate 3. I'm gonna break it up into acts, so we'll start with Act 1. I spent some time playing Divinity Original Sin 2, so that was my background with Larian. You can kind of see the bones of Baldur's Gate 3 in Divinity, preparing themselves for this moment. And obviously they really stuck the landing. It's a critically acclaimed game on all fronts. Basically every outlet that I've ever seen has given it a glowing review. What I want to talk about in this video is how this game communicated itself to me. I'm less interested in knowing everything about the game and all of the secrets and all of the ideal ways to play, but just as someone sort of diving in the deep end right away, what is that experience like? So I went in blind and did what I could to make sure that I wasn't spoiling much, if anything. And so some of my takes might come off as a bit ignorant, but that's sort of the point. You know, I'm trying to make sure that I'm not tainted by the voices of others. Acts 2 and 3 are gonna happen in separate videos, so I would just ask that you refrain from spoilers outside of Act 1. That being said, I'm going to spoil all of Act 1, like pretty much every story beat that I experience. So it's totally fine to talk about Act 1 spoilers in the comments if you'd like to. It might look a bit later, and that's because my SIM card ran out of data. I'm also going to be focusing a lot on the UX and UI of this game, just because that's my profession. I'm a UX designer, so it's what I'm comfortable talking shop about. With that said, let's hit it. Baldur's Gate 3, Act 1.
For whatever reason, the bombastic Nautiloid invasion which kicks off the game was a little off-putting for me initially. I'm inclined to believe that it was an irrational or biased reaction painted by my prior experience with and expectations of the world of Faerun. I was anticipating a slower, more humble start, Zelda-like in quality, which allowed for the momentum to build to something dangerous. But Baldur's Gate 3 immediately drops you onto a flying hell. You'll be fighting demonic monsters, recruiting quadrupedal brain homies, saving companions who will die if you're not careful, and dodging mind flayers. There are already a host of decisions that you'll make which, for better or for worse, could leave you kicking yourself for your naivete later on. Retroactively, I've learned to appreciate this start, not only because it's super high energy and super badass, but also because you have a controllable character in your hands immediately, with the intensity dialed to 11. I've gotten all too used to that feeling of anxious anticipation, where a game edges you with exposition that you're mostly ignoring while absolutely fiending to put those sticks in your aching hands to good use. I also much prefer in situ tutorialization to a tutorial where you're plopped in a training simulation. The onboarding they went with works really well with this game's world in particular, since characters can have legendary pasts despite being level 1. There's somebodies in this world, and the game isn't using that trope where their powers have been completely stripped down, so no one should be out there fighting training dummies. Leading the charge through this Nautiloid is my glorious, parasite-infested, Chad, Wood Elf, Ranger, Beastmaster named Sylvanas, nice! Constructed in the very well-designed character creator. I wasn't trying to create someone who looked like myself, but if I was, I might have been upset at the fact that I'm working with facial presets rather than sliders, a complaint I recently heard on the Min-Max podcast while comparisons were being made to Dragon's Dogma's equally, if not more, impressive character creator. However, my assumption here would be that the facial presets make for better facial animations during dialogue scenes, so I'm not going to harp on this too much. It was enough to satisfy me. I know you can also choose to play as one of the pre-made characters, which is a Larian staple, so if anyone in the comments would like to speak to how that experience differs from a brand new character, I'd be really interested in hearing how it went for you. Sylvanas is based off of my original D&D character created back in 2018 for my first campaign. He's an estranged noble, once a leader of his people with good in his heart, but an easy victim to the promise of retribution and power. I came up with his name by looking up the god of the forest in the player's handbook. I think that's the Wood Elf naming equivalent of Muhammad. My first gameplay reaction was essentially, oh word, this is just Dungeons & Dragons. I was able to choose the same abilities and spells that Sylvanas actually brandished all those years ago while leveling up, and while Sylvanas stood like a deactivated NPC off to the right, and see how their effects differed from my imagination and how they appeared in-game. In combat, dice rolls have been abstracted to damage ranges and chance to hit percentages, and movement is based solely on distance rather than a grid system. But these are all perfectly seamless alterations that work to benefit the medium. Also, the art for the spells and actions is very well executed, with clear iconography that helps establish a connection through repetition with the spell and its effects, and a color-coded system that helps identify the action or spell's broader categorization. I'm sure there are modifications that run contrary to the exact rules of D&D tabletop combat, but Larian would have done the world a massive favor by developing an encounter creator for Dungeons & Dragons players all over the world who play virtually, myself included. All the assets and environments are right there for it, and there isn't an existing service specific to Dungeons & Dragons that can hold a candle to this. We use Roll20 for our sessions, which is a serviceable 2D platform, but I'd much rather achieve a bit more immersion with something like this. I would be ecstatic if I could use this game's combat system with my friends, because it is seriously good. The tabletop mechanics play a critical, faithful, and intriguing part in dialogue as well, as you're provided with a solid range of options to contribute to the conversation you're having, with the more risky options requiring a skill check. Here, it's super important to have a good grasp on the attributes that your character has a proficiency in, because if you don't choose an option that they'll skillfully answer, you'll likely bungle the dice roll. And you'll only know that your modifier to the d20 is poor after you've locked in your dialogue option, so you're screwed unless you load back to earlier in your playthrough. You can, however, support your rolls with magical items, inspiration which you get from completing quests, and a spell called Guidance, which Shadowheart assisted me with during my conversations. For Sylvanas, I made sure to boost his charisma, or Riz, for the uninitiated, and then relied heavily on passing persuasion checks in order to de-escalate would-be violent confrontations. I have a couple suggestions for this system. One would be to include your modifiers next to your dialogue options so that you'd know your chances at success. I understand that if you're focused on that plus X number, that's taking your attention away from the quality of the dialogue, but in times when success on a dialogue option can be crucial for the kind of character you're trying to play, or the outcome that you're looking for, that kind of granularity can be helpful. I still find myself unsure of how Sylvanas will fare on a certain dialogue check because I'm not looking at his character sheet enough to recall those numbers, nor do I think that should be a responsibility of mine. And I'm sure that the conversation designers are well versed in the RPG dialogue literature and know full well that other games have this sort of transparency. So I'm sure this decision was a measured and deliberate one, potentially for immersion within the dialogue, but that's also a mystery to me because of how visible the numbers are in other aspects of this game. Further, I would love there to be some sort of additional communication of your character's success or failure. One of my favorite elements to my personal Dungeons & Dragons experience is watching my DM's characters react to a crit success or crit fail.
Natural 20! No!
But Baldur's Gate just seems to proceed with a pretty standard pass-fail binary as far as I've been able to observe.
Oh, let's go.
He's right. No one's safe if that thing goes loose. Not even us.
Damaze?
Enough. Lower the trap.
The Fallout games, for example, alter the skill checks copy based on the player character's proficiency, so if you're unintelligent, you'll be leading with really unintelligent comments, and the NPCs will react in kind to your stupidity. With Baldur's Gate, the feeling is more that the NPC's presuppositions are informing their decision making, and the actual content of the dialogue doesn't matter at all, which makes it lose a bit of its persuasive value. In the future, I foresee a core mechanic of some bleeding-edge RPG being a text box instead of pre-written options, meaning that you're completely responsible for your character's dialogue, which would require a ton of attention paid to the story, but could be aided by some sort of hint system. AI would determine how the content of your contributions relates to a specific skill check, with the game systems responding in turn. For now though, I find the player character's writing engaging, with there almost always being an option to support Sylvanas' well-intentioned actions. It's honestly also insane how approaching every NPC results in the camera changing to a close-up, revealing a beautifully designed, amazingly voice-acted character who might only have a sentence or two to say to you. I don't think I've been more satisfied with voice acting variability in performance, motion capture, and character design since God of War. Modern games still have a noticeable uncanny valley, but Baldur's Gate has seemingly conquered it. You know how in some games you can tell which character models had all the effort put into them, and you can see the obvious dip in quality between important people and randos? and how that can be immersion breaking. Not here. In Baldur's Gate 3, the randos have the same kind of love shown to them as the stars, and every character feels like they could be important down the road. The consistency and quality over dozens of hours of play is a masterful achievement. This extends to the sound design, music, and overall atmosphere as well.
Were warned to stay away. Now you'll have to face the consequences.
Alright. Fair. Oh, Jesus Christ. Oh my god, Asterian's already down. That is brutal.
Even in Act 1, there's an incredible amount of variation in the environments, which I'll continue to showcase throughout the video. I especially love this battle theme, which includes the soundtrack's recurring, recognizable motif. And for the companions specifically, they're all achievements in their own right, with complicated feelings towards you, each other, and the world they live in. The game also indulges my desire to stay and chat with my companions regularly, since conversation options with them will refresh as you progress. I wanted all of them in my party at once, but I had to settle with creating spicy group dynamics, and later strategizing ideal battle combinations as the combat difficulty increased. Some other quick mentions I wanted to make regarding the clear and obvious tabletop influence from D&D involve exploration. The HUD includes a mini-map that's amazingly reminiscent of a top-down pen and paper battle map, and as you're exploring the world, you'll hear a satisfying dice roll sound effect and see a small UI element pop up that indicates a passive skill check just occurred. If you fail, it'll sometimes remain a mystery what you would have discovered or what kind of historical knowledge your character may have had about the world, while success can reveal additional lore or secrets.
A Seluna statue in a stinking cave. Hardly a place of honor even for the likes of her.
It was helpful to be exposed to that kind of consistent failure early on, as if the game was telling me, hey, it's okay not to get everything right. It made my character's abilities feel refreshingly humanoid, imperfect, and fallible, and released some of the obligation I sometimes feel to discover and understand everything in a game. Now feels like the best place to discuss my control preferences. I am playing on PC, but opted to use a controller rather than my mouse and keyboard. Nowadays, I tend to reserve my mouse and keyboard for first-person games, or anything where accurate aiming is important. Interestingly, the entire UI changes when switching between control inputs, and it appears as though the user interfaces were designed by two different design teams entirely. The mouse and keyboard UI follows very standard genre conventions, which I'm choosing not to speak to in depth just due to lack of hands-on time with it. On the other hand, the controller UI upscales all of the UI elements so that they're more readable, and relies heavily on radial menus for combat, as well as for the pause menu. Personally, I've loved using radial menus since playing Zelda Twilight Princess and think they are criminally underutilized. It's such a nice way to swap between active weapons if you have multiple, for instance, like in Rockstar games. Having several radial menus that you can carousel between, with more menus added as your inventory grows, feels like a striking novelty. Other than navigating the minor learning curve of getting used to all the icons, understanding why certain actions are grouped together, and learning not to hold on to the right bumper because it curiously supercycles you to the end of the carousel, this system manages a complex range of potential actions masterfully. In creating simplicity with the controller, however, some aspects of the experience are hard to comprehend or discover, which makes sense. While Baldur's Gate 3 is kind of a third-person game, it's managing so much more complexity than a standard third-person experience, so there aren't consistent parallels with those games' standard control mapping. 3 instances come to mind where I was struggling with controller UI and controls. Crouching is one, which I just looked up, and it's allegedly holding down on the D-pad. I probably could have figured this out in retrospect, but I distinctly recall pressing every button on the controller before giving up. Contrastingly, it's a more intuitive C on the keyboard, which I was actually switching to when pickpocketing because I didn't know how else to do it. The second instance is companion approval levels, which I couldn't find anywhere in the controller UI's character sheet, so I think they're only available in the mouse and keyboard UI. The third is the progress bar for a character's turn. From my time playing D&D, I know a character has movement, an action, and a bonus action. I have no idea how that information is translating to the progress bar. It's just not tracking for me intuitively. Overall, I'm super happy with the innovations made for the controller, as it makes the game more accessible to a more diverse audience and worked well with my current preferences. So, how did Sylvanas fare on Act 1 of his adventure, as he searched for a way to extract the worm all snuggled up in his brain, a worm which would eventually transform him into an abominable mind flayer? After escaping the Nautiloid with Lae'zel and the walking brain, having saved Shadowheart from her pod, and responsible for one accidental mind flayer transformation, I hurtled through the air toward a beach, nearly crash landing before having my fall softened somehow. I collected Shadowheart on the beach, killed even more brain guys, their government name actually Intellect Devourers by the way, got scammed at knife point by Asterion, stomped a mind flayer's skull in, pulled Gale out of a magic orifice, saved Lae'zel by murdering her tiefling captors, which I didn't want to do, but I felt I had no choice in order to save her, and then aided Will in defending the Druid Grove from attacking goblins. Just like that, I had 5 new, morally divisive, romantically adventurous friends to be. In my first hours of traversal and exploration, I found the deliberately slow, weighty pace of the characters to lack the natural movement I was looking for, but I didn't mind that I couldn't sprint around. The Act 1 map isn't a vast open world, it's relatively small, and every corner feels saturated with life and deliberately designed by people. The slow pace of the player character works completely to the game's benefit, as it forces the player to pay more attention to the carefully crafted environments, enjoy the banter between companions, and search thoughtfully for secrets and diverse character interactions, instead of ripping in between points of interest. It did require a mid-livestream comment to learn how to jump, initiated using the unintuitive up button on the D-pad. Oh, there it is. Thank you, pal. I don't think jumping is a required tutorial action on the Nautiloid, which is a curious decision to me since it's a critical tool for traversal and combat in this game. There's also a very useful radial scanning tool that you activate by holding A on an Xbox controller.
Oh, I can hold A? Oh, that's sick.
Which initiates a list view of all the lootable entities within that radius. Before knowing I had that tool at my disposal, I was carefully, needlessly moving my joystick over a crowded table or altar trying to get the correct item highlighted. At the time, it felt daunting to consider what other mechanics I was overlooking.
These controls are obviously right here, I just didn't look at the screen for long enough.
Anyways, alongside my new crew, I explored the camp I had just defended, in which tensions between the two groups residing on shared land were immediately palpable.
Well met. I should warn you, visitors are no longer welcome in this grove.
The tieflings living in the settlement, none of whom seeming to know or care that I murdered 2 of their kinsmen earlier, are displaced refugees looking for asylum. Ultimately, the tieflings would be happy to leave, but the road to the city of Baldur's Gate, title drop, is swarming with a violent goblin menace. As a result, they're currently sharing land sacred to an exclusive group of druids, with a leader who has no intention of offering the safety of their shelter in the long term. In fact, they're so done with their squatters that they've imprisoned a ne'er-do-well tiefling child, and their shitty interim leader Kaga plans to sacrifice her to a big hungry snake.
This special animal eats people.
Sylvanas successfully talked Kaga down from this risk. But as I've been told by a friend who had things go differently for him, this can lead to an immediate bloody conflict between the two groups with massive casualties, no matter which side you decide to support. Of course, this is anecdotal, and I'm deliberately not fact-checking it to sanctify it as a genuine water cooler story. Regardless, I love how differently these tensions can be resolved if you don't roll your dice right, and generally enjoy how much importance is placed in the dialogue options, which encourages players to lock in and choose their words wisely. With a child saved from certain snake death and without an immediate war on my hands, I was able to pursue other options to resolve this conflict. I caught wind that the actual druid leader, Halsin, could be more open-minded to the tieflings remaining in the grove, but he had been captured by the aforementioned goblins. I want to pull away from the story briefly to discuss my experience with active quests and how the overworld map communicates them to the player. At this point in my playthrough, I was racking up active quests, which I would argue are not well communicated in the journal, with poor font hierarchy that makes the volume of the text presented wildly daunting, and a critical lack of clarity as it relates to which quests translate to waypoint markers on your map. I'm navigating a fantasy world which, despite having a fair bit of familiarity as a D&D player, is blitzing me with a high volume of new characters, narratives, and concepts in a very short amount of time. It's difficult to parse through all of the information when there's zero text which helps clarify it. Despite finding The Witcher 3's quest design to be initially opaque, I found the small blurbs it included of Geralt's take on each quest to be extremely helpful for orienting myself, and would love for that kind of inclusion within Baldur's Gate's journal. Further, for some reason, you can't prioritize waypoints as far as I was able to discover, which made early navigation a huge pain. In the process of getting my bearings in a new world, which I hadn't yet built familiarity with through repeated traversal, I was faced with multiple identical waypoints to parse through, causing me to flip back and forth between my big map and minimap, actually using the cardinal directions on the minimap's compass to start traveling in the right direction. I can't tell you the last time I relied on a game's compass. I found this process tedious, and I have no idea why the game doesn't allow you to deselect or prioritize any given waypoint. I think the combination of these issues, in addition to the onslaught of new information lasered at the player regarding their character's abilities, plus all the abilities of their companions, can muddle this experience for those who don't have a prior background with Dungeons & Dragons, even when considering the ways in which the game supports the player with tutorials. Tutorial design presents such an interesting challenge, as you're providing information to players that gets in the way of their experience and can present as an annoyance. Adequately tutorializing a player is like getting them to take their medicine, and definitely not the yummy tasting kind like Motrin. Considering the huge range of prior knowledge players might have before loading this game up, plus the sheer volume of conceptual knowledge needed to thrive while playing this game, I'm honestly unsure of how I would ideally present all that new info in a one-size-fits-all manner. Ultimately, I'm pretty supportive of beginner guides on YouTube, which seem to naturally materialize for games this big and complex. And developers can essentially count on these videos to exist within the first few days of their game releasing. It's certainly more approachable to someone like me than a written tutorial menu like what Baldur's Gate has with little visual accompaniment. However, I don't doubt that this game lost a fair share of players before they thought to look a beginner's guide up, in part due to some quality of life shortcomings and opaque mechanics, but also due to the unavoidable weight of this high fantasy RPG. Now, to head back into Sylvanas' journey. On my hunt for the druid leader Halsin, I wandered over to the goblin camp, encountering a ton of goblins on the journey. I was able to avoid fighting all of them, including the unexpectedly intellectual ogres, with a legendary run of persuasion checks.
A robust diet makes for a shrewd mind, you see.
At this point, I was also racking up so much inspiration, which allows you to reroll, that I wouldn't take failure as an option. I had an inkling that the rate at which I was earning inspiration was likely going to wane, and I was right, but I was not in the habit of saving it for later. I spent the entirety of too many games hoarding benefits just to never use them, so I've recently been determined to switch up my habits. Before reaching my destination, I had a brief encounter with a group of Githyanki who were pressing us hard about an artifact that Shadowheart had hidden on her person. It was great to see the competing interests unfold in the party between Shadowheart's desire to hold on to the artifact and Lae'zel's internal strife of complete trust in her people versus the growing respect for me as the group's leader. Ultimately, I felt suspicious of the Githyanki, in no small part to Lae'zel's pattern of brazen behavior, and I did not give this artifact up. Upon entering the goblin camp, there was no immediate aggression, and I was free to walk around and talk to a bunch of truly upstanding folks, who all bore the mark of a deity they had begun unquestioningly following, called the Absolute. I knew they weren't the best people, villains even, but I had no intention of massacring them. They're obviously easily manipulated and victims of their circumstances. With that said, I'm not suggesting that they're redeemable. Ideally, I was interested in containing their reprehensible activity however I could without going full arrows ablaze on them. Eventually, I found Halsin in bear form, imprisoned and surrounded by goblins who were tormenting him. I want to preface my actions by saying that I was walking a fine line between preserving my tenuous peace with the goblins and saving the prisoners scattered about the encampment. I had no idea whether violent actions against this smaller goblin band would enrage the entire camp. So, in an effort to briefly fit in with the goblins, anticipating a future persuasion check to shoo them away so that I could free him in isolation, I threw a rock at Halsin. Regrettably, this is where he became aggressive and busted out, attacking both myself and the group of goblins. This outcome leveled me. I was battling a couple competing emotions here. For one, I respected the game for decisively initiating combat based on my actions in a situation where it was obvious that I could have achieved a different outcome if I had played my cards right. On the other hand, I was devastated that my grand plan was thwarted by a misstep, and that there was no way to de-escalate the fight and convince Halsin that we came in peace, at least to the best of my knowledge. My first inclination was to load back, but it would have set me back farther than I was comfortable going. Oh, that autosave is from hella long ago. Just as a quick aside, I'm definitely not in love with the way this game handles autosaves. I did some menu digging and found that you could increase the maximum number of autosaves in your files at one time, and that might potentially increase the rate at which autosaves are happening, but the default rate feels very inconsistent. I would anticipate the saves happening whenever I entered a new area, discovered something noteworthy, or had a long conversation with someone, but hours can go by without an autosave. Plus, when there is an autosave, it tends to happen before a major event, which spoils the surprise a little bit. Also, controller mapping is locked, so there's no way to make quick saving a hotkey, even with the extra back buttons I have on my special little Best Buy controller. Is all of this deliberately designed to discourage save scumming? Should I be okay with not being able to rely on save scumming unless I'm very diligent with my own saving habits? I tend to much prefer when games are consistently saving the game for me, so the act of saving is never a distraction from the game itself. While playing Baldur's Gate, I was constantly worried about my saving habits and lost huge chunks of time consistently. My hours played was 45, while the time on my save is 30 hours. 15 hours gone is ridiculous. There's an argument to be made that that's just my fault and I need to be more diligent.
Oh. I gotta save at the campsite. Oh. Fuck. Fuck.
But if quality of life changes could fix this, then I would tend to disagree. I continued to try slapping a band-aid on this situation by only attacking the goblins, my temporary allies, and using non-lethal force on Halsin, so that I could eventually return him to consciousness and convince him of my good intentions. This game doesn't support this line of thinking, however. Once the battle ended, Halsin was considered dead in the dialogue that followed, despite being labeled as knocked out with 1 hit point.
Was once a living bear is now a dead elf.
Wait, I used non...
The dead elf must be Halsin.
I looked up whether a scroll of Revivify would work on him, but the thread I checked said that he would still be aggressive. It was obvious to me at this point that non-lethal force is just a shallow means to tell yourself you're doing a non-lethal playthrough, and that I should abandon any hope I had to bring Halsin back on my side. His contribution to the story was cut short. I was pretty bummed out at this point that I would never learn what kind of character he was, or how he could have influenced the druids to potentially allow for coexistence. I appreciated the game for the freedom it did award me, while cursing it for its interactivity ceiling. And of course, this game does need a ceiling somewhere, it's not the Matrix. I just anticipated it to work with my imagination a bit more than it did. I'm spending so much time discussing this particular section because it was a huge turning point for my playthrough. I headed back to the Tiefling Zevlor to explain my failure in extracting Halsin, and his suggestion for how to proceed was simple, if not a bit political. Kill the goblin leaders and the goblins will scatter. The thing is, I don't know how to do that without pissing off the entire goblin camp, so this is pretty much a thinly veiled call for genocide. Out of the 3 groups, I found the Tieflings the most sympathetic, as they were the people I felt sought peace and were most deserving of peace. So without too much hesitation, well, I actually did put this off for a bit and did some side quests, found Scratch, and met a new companion, Karlak. I marched back into the goblin camp and massacred every single one of them, utterly abandoning my previously peaceful and de-escalating playstyle, clearing the passage to Baldur's Gate. I felt sick to my stomach doing so, despite being morally opposed to the goblins' beliefs. Overall, I think these feelings are testaments to the strengths of the game as opposed to its weaknesses. If I hadn't been so burned by Halsin's terminal unconsciousness, if my path to reaching that conclusion to kill was more seamless, and if I wasn't so focused on my save states, the decision to commit such violence, since I felt I had no other choice, would have weighed far more heavily on me. But I guess all that doesn't matter now because we're partying with the Tieflings. Knowing that there are multiple outcomes, I was wondering if this can instead be a party with the druids or even the goblins under different circumstances. The Tiefling presence was somewhat of an afterthought, however, because there was some palpable lustful tension in the air between Sylvanas and his companions. Depending on my relationship or approval with each companion, they seemed to be either horny for me or keen to get it on with just about anyone else.
Sex. Not with you, just to be clear. I mean, can you imagine? Ugh, no.
I had turned Astarion down earlier in the adventure, hadn't had any romantic conversation with Will or Gale yet.
There's something like the anticipation of a kiss, then the pleasure of being cloaked in peace. You are safe.
Oh my god.
You are nestled in the cup of Mystra's hand.
And was still too new in my friendship with Karlak to want to choose the I have a huge crush on you option. That felt like it was going to backfire, so I didn't go for it. In general, everyone seemingly shooting their shot with you at one point or another can feel daunting. I did appreciate the constant will they won't they dynamic as a means to spice things up, but it felt initially difficult to cultivate any strict friendships. Imagine if, in your friend group, every single person had at one point professed their interest in you, and you had to turn them all down, then act like everything was still normal. That's kind of how it feels operating in this group. Lae'zel was extremely forward with me in front of the entire party fairly recently.
I want to taste you.
And Shadowheart voiced her interest in sharing a bottle of wine with me after everyone had gone to bed. It was kind of spicy that Lae'zel and Shadowheart were both into Sylvanas while not fucking with each other whatsoever. In the end, I felt that the most obvious choice for Sylvanas was Lae'zel, since we'd been through a lot together and she seemed to be coming around on me with some clear signs of respect, despite being quite curt and rude at times. So we got it on, and I asked afterwards if we could make love again, to which she replied,
Love. I might give you a lay should my whim so take me, but I won't give you love. Up now. Your moment's over.
After that, I was brimming with questions about how romance actually works in this game. I'm not sure if Lae'zel is meant to be more eager than others to bed you and then show zero affection afterwards so that you feel free to pursue other characters, or if this relationship is meant to progress to something more meaningful in the later acts. I was definitely disappointed in the lack of dialogue options with her which addressed the relationship in conversations that followed. I could only ask Lae'zel to end our fling, if you can call it that, which felt so dispassionate, especially since I was starting to form a bond with her in our later adventures that I felt keen to communicate with her. The game practically begs you to move on. For me, the Tiefling celebration felt like a video game checkpoint, Romance Edition, and would not progress at all as I dove into more Act 1 content, especially since there was little reference to romance with other characters afterwards, likely because I was locked in with Lae'zel. Shadowheart didn't jealously address the romance with Lae'zel as I anticipated, but she does tell you how much she adores you as a companion if you ask her. My complacency may have shot me in the foot here though. I haven't yet, but I'm somewhat interested in breaking things off to see if something could form with another character before jumping into Act 2, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was too late for Sylvanas. Maybe Lae'zel will come around. After the celly, I went to Auntie Ethel. She turned into a hag. I didn't let her help me with the tadpole. I attacked her instead. Then I battled my way through her torture dungeon, and I didn't save Mayrina because I didn't realize her cage was going to break.
Gods, please!
Oh, did the girl die?
I actually killed her brothers earlier too, and then I finished off the hag, for the time being, so she warned. I watched Will get turned into a demon by Mizora for refusing to kill Karlach since we convinced him she was actually nice. I was paid a second visit by the Dream Lady in my sleep. I went to Joaquin's Rest, saved Counselor Floric, and she asked me to find someone who I can't find until Act 2. I killed a bunch of bandits in the chapel, which became a dank crypt, where I killed some undead priests. I fought a bunch of gnolls at the site of a destroyed caravan and met some Zentarum traders who did not help me win the fight at all, so I'm definitely feeling pretty suspect towards them.
We should help.
Don't be a fool, lad. Shut your mouth and keep your head down.
I fought woodwoads and mud methods in the swamp. I killed the monster hunter by accident after letting it slip that Asterion, the vampire he was looking for, was in my party.
I declared death to goblins, and then death to more goblins.
And then I discovered the Underdark. At this point, I thought I was nearly done with Act 1, not realizing I was more accurately halfway finished, so the whole time I'm down there, I'm playing with the assumption that I only have a couple hours to go and that entering the mountain pass will trigger Act 2.
Okay. Maybe I should just do it, because it's part of Act 1 and I'm about to enter Act 2.
I was far from correct on both accounts, which definitely colored my feelings about this latter portion of my journey. I'd characterize the Underdark as an exciting, thematic change of pace with solid uptick in difficulty and a daunting but intriguing selection of secrets to uncover. I did myself no favors in my first moments down there, convinced that the only way forward was to jump over a locked gate which caused fall damage, and I had no featherfall on hand. Further still, I have a bad habit of advancing a one-person scouting party with half health who inevitably picks a fight they can't win. Predictably, I entered the classic predicament of going up against two Minotaurs with a completely split party under threat of multiple hours of lost progress if I let everyone die. I carefully managed the conflict and barely survived with whoever survived, wasting all of my scrolls of Revivify in the process.
Oh my god, we did it.
This really bummed me out at first because I didn't know withers could reliably res you and your companions for cheap. And after all that hassle, there was a side window I could have taken instead of hopping the gate, which I didn't discover until the very end of my Underdark survey, hours later. Despite the scary stakes I subjected myself to, I loved that the non-linearity presented by this level design gave me a unique story to tell. I was walking around with a half-destroyed party, too proud to make camp yet, as I was sure I'd encounter some kind of peaceful settlement. Unfortunately, when I saw the Myconids from a distance, I judged them by their scary fungal appearance rather than their character, and I noped right out of there to do some additional treacherous exploring before looping back and realizing they were a peaceful people. The Myconids are cool. I love that they coexist peacefully with a bunch of interesting humanoids with fun side quests on offer, and I especially think that the Blurg and Omelium combo is a compelling one. A peaceful mind flayer, how about that? And it turns out all the Sovereign wants is for you to deal with a couple dwarves by the river who have been killing off Myconids. Easy, or so I thought. I set right off on this task, joined by an excitable militant Myconid who was unfortunately massacred in the first moments of battle.
But this fight happens close to a boat, which leads you to the Dwergar-inhabited Grimforge, which is huge.
Way bigger than it needs to be for what you're meant to do down there, I'd argue. So, about the Grimforge. I kinda hated my time there. There are so many skill checks stacked on top of each other, and yes, I finally ran out of inspiration. In the two locations of interest, the Mine Cave-In and the Path to the Ancient Forge are split by a cumbersome walk down a long, glorified hallway, one which I traversed back and forth multiple times as I tried to figure out the best course of action. It was here I wish my party had a bit more pep in their step, my god. I believe smoke powder bombs are required to have on hand if you're unsuccessful in getting the Rothe to help with the rock pile, and I had no idea how to find more bombs if I misused them. The path to the Ancient Forge is hard traveled, but less in a fun way and more in a hitting your head against the wall until you finally figure out the right direction kind of way. The Adamantine Forge itself is useless to the Duergar quest, and the actual person of interest in that section, Philomene, was really difficult to find because her location was not put on my map despite the gnomes I spoke to offering just that. I think this was a bug, but it resulted in me having to look up her hideout after meticulously searching for it. While I'm sure I was having a uniquely poor time with this location, I found myself frustrated throughout my Grimforge traversal due mostly to the communication between level design and quest design, which led to a lot of back and forth trekking, directionless investigation, and far more save scumming than I was comfortable with. This entire frustrating experience came to a head when I went to blow up the cave-in to extract Nier, the drow leader of the Duergar. First off, why can't I approach the cave-in and initiate a dialogue option to plant the explosive? Instead, I have to enter my inventory and drop it on the ground where it oftentimes bounces a distance away from the rocks that made me skeptical as to whether or not it would actually blow up the cave-in. Also, it's only then that the gnome slaves evacuate the blast zone, meaning that it's impossible to try other means of destruction on the cave-in without starting a battle. Once you do blow up the cave-in, Nier emerges, and unless you're pro gnome slavery, you're gonna be fighting this dude, and with him the entire camp of Duergar. This fight is actually fucked. It's so hard since there's so many people who join in. This is a great place to mention that every fight in this game is pretty hard won, even in the balanced difficulty, and your strategic chops will certainly be tested from the get-go. Oh no. I was often left with my entire party destroyed and at one hit point after long fought and hard won battles. I know this fight can be made easier with a particular side quest, since I spoke to a couple unconvinced Duergar that you can pull onto your side. I didn't end up doing this, and I am not sure if this fight was possible for me to win without their help. I'm pretty torn about this encounter. Baldur's Gate seems to expect failure, which is why there are autosaves before big battles, albeit inconsistent ones. That seems to suggest a desire for failure to be a moment for the player to reevaluate their strategy and more intelligently approach their second attempt at the fight. Combat repetition is a good thing in this game. However, the difficulty spike was so insurmountable that I decided to ambush the Duergar before extracting Nier, using my knowledge about how brutal the encounter was to change its outcome. It felt a bit cheap to find success this way, acting on information that my character wouldn't know himself. I would characterize this instance as immersion breaking, but also somewhat attributed to not covering my bases fully before jumping into battle, or recognizing the potential outcomes of my actions, especially while carrying that unwavering slave-freeing resolve. Although, when I think about this encounter in the context of the metagame, and as a challenge to those who have done multiple playthroughs, my opinion on it softens quite a bit. If you know what's coming, the careful preparation for that conflict makes what I imagine to be really compelling gameplay. At this point, I've noticed I'm balancing a delicate ethical system with my playthrough. I'm constantly asking myself if the negative consequences of my actions feel like genuine failures of Sylvanas, which contribute to the story and should be kept in my save, or if they're cheap consequences of the video game not reacting to my choices in a way that I expect or find fair. The result is me carefully editing my experience through save scumming to ensure that it's mostly in line with my expectations. I would rather not be doing this if I felt like I could avoid it without ruining my adventure. This is where Baldur's Gate's observed promise of boundless player freedom shoots itself in the foot as far as I'm concerned, since I'm not really doing insane things to reach the limits of its capabilities, and when I do reach those limits, I find myself a bit disappointed. This Grimforge section definitely soured my experience with the game for a while, but I did press on and recover from it over time with leveled expectations and better interactions down the road. From here on out, I'm looking to wrap up my time in Act 1, which involves discovering remaining map locations, finishing straggler quests, and heading into the mountain pass for the Githyanki Crèche. A quick note here about camp. That's where you retreat to heal your party, chat with your companions, manage your collected items, and more. For the most part, I like how camp functions. I think it's great that there's a small survival mechanic with the supplies you collect, and it's pretty generous that you can exit to camp for healing whenever, as long as you aren't in combat. I noted, however, at this point in my adventure, that the drama in my nights at camp where the story passively progresses as you heal up, were starting to decline significantly. Noticing that made me feel as though I was overstaying my welcome in Act 1, as the seemingly endless well of incredible companion content started to dry up. Camp started to feel more like an obligation than an exciting part of the game. I know that I can't expect infinite character work, especially since these characters are going to grow and change in the acts to follow, but I can't help but mention it made Sylvanas' journey start to feel more solitary. It's also been difficult for me to decide upon favorite companions yet because each person's personal story still feels very much in its infancy. But Gale's high-stakes romance with Mystra and impending doom might be the most engaging for me so far. I also like that he sometimes hints at breaking the fourth wall as his turn in combat starts.
Pawn to Cleric 4.
It was here in my journey that my experience with Baldur's Gate 3 shifted significantly, but not because of the game itself. I was eventually joined in my livestream by a handful of viewers who are extremely well-versed in the game. I immediately clocked their experience from their astute suggestions, plus the mentions that they had done 30 playthroughs, or were currently grinding through the game's honor mode difficulty, or had 400 hours logged on one save without yet beating the game. They very much knew their stuff. It's important to mention here that I'm aware that being joined by viewers who are giving me pointers is inherently biasing my opinion. However, it's also important to mention just how much information I was ignorant to before it was explained to me in the livestream comment section. Before the mountain pass, this group helped me discover the spider lair and kill the broodmother, learn how to pickpocket, which was definitely against Sylvanas' alignment, but who am I to turn a pragmatic stream viewer down, uncover the secret Zentarum hideout in Joaquin's Rest, acquire the materials to unlock the Adamantine Forge, beat the Forge boss, Grim, on my first try, respec Shadowheart so she'd be a far more useful cleric, find the Kuotoa fish people, navigate the treacherous path to the Arcane Tower and ensure that Bernard gave me a hug, acquire the Club of Hill Giant Strength, and have Omelium give me drugs. And this is hazy because I was streaming until 6 AM when this happened, and I felt like I was method acting as Sylvanas. I would have likely skipped all of this content due to ignorance on how to push the quest forward or discover the locations. And that would have been totally fine, but I'm really glad I didn't miss this extra content because it was all super fun. And I'm generally not someone who replays games after rolling credits, so shout out to my helpers. Another aspect of the game I've been struggling to cope with throughout, which my stream viewers helped with, is inventory management. I find that I'm not meshing well with the inventory menu, as it's very difficult to wade through a massive stack of items and parse through relevant ones. I'm not into the massive info box that comes up, where you can compare an item with the one you have equipped. Critically, you can hide this menu when you don't need it. In an ideal world, I would like the inventory menu to be more reminiscent of Diablo 4's, where your equipped items surround your player, you can tab between item filters rather than using a filter dropdown, and the comparison info boxes are hovering over less dense space so that the player can parse through that information more easily. I also miss that you have pouches within your pack used to hide the inventory items you don't need to consistently see, like potions for instance, which removes so much clutter from the inventory. I didn't find this out until my most recent play session, and I was dealing with complete item chaos up to that point. Why does this happen automatically for alchemical ingredients and camp supplies, but not potions? The inconsistency there creates confusion and obscures the useful existence of pouches. I also had very little grasp on what was valuable to me throughout my journey. There's an overwhelming amount of stuff, and I think almost all of it has some functional value, but I can only use my best judgment as I'm going through an initial playthrough. It was helpful to pick up alchemical ingredients and see that I unlocked recipes, and I would have appreciated more systems akin to that. Alchemy is often a banished art when I play fantasy games, mostly because when a recipe calls for an ingredient I don't know how to find, I have no idea how to go about looking, so I lose patience for it. To be honest, even with the recipe provided, I'm still so ingredient poor right now that alchemy feels impossible yet again. One of my viewers, however, changed my outlook on item acquisition through a series of suggestions where they essentially ordered me to pick up everything remotely valuable in a room. This isn't obvious, but you can just send any item you have to camp immediately without being in camp. So you're actually best off if you're totally inclusive with the items you pick up and then ship them off to camp to sift through them and sell later on, lest you abandon a valuable object. I'm still not totally sold on this style of play, especially for a first playthrough where I'm not necessarily focused on optimizing my items and loadout. Either way, it's helpful to know that these measures exist so you can simplify inventory management. A process that's more hopelessly broken is gear management. I put it off for a while, but eventually I decided to equip my team with all the gear I had discovered on my journey. This process was considerably cumbersome. I wanted to have all my enchanted weapons, armor, and jewelry in my inventory to give every item a fair evaluation, so I cleared all of my usual items out and pulled everything in from my traveler's chest at camp. This encumbered me, so I transferred items into a companion's inventory, then extracted the rest of the equipment from the chest. Then I was able to start equipping my party, which is made easier with the filter options that let you see everyone's inventory when equipping, and filter non-proficient equipment out of the selection process. However, I could not equip the rest of my companions since they're not in my party, even though I'm at camp and everyone's right there. Then I had to give my equipment to another companion, so I wasn't crawling around camp when asking the other 3 companions to replace my existing party. I realized that I couldn't equip items that were in non-partied companions' inventories, however, so I had the item holders rejoin my party, transferred those items to one of the second set of companions' inventories, then reassembled companion group 2 in order to adequately outfit them.
That is extremely broken.
And it's okay if that didn't make any sense to you, because it doesn't make any sense to me either. Why in God's name isn't there a dedicated equipment menu that filters all your equipment and lets you outfit all of your companions at once? In short, inventory management is a hugely important part of a 100+ hour RPG, especially one without many throwaway items. And for all the reasons I mentioned here, I feel like both iterations of this menu, keyboard and controller UI, do the player a disservice. I definitely had anxious feelings towards inventory management and avoided it unless it was necessary not to. Okay, so we're really wrapping this up now. I was off to the absolutely gorgeous mountain pass to get to the Githyanki Creche.
What a sight! We should stop for a nice little lunch. Take it on in.
Ensuring that Lae'zel was in my party so that I could get her special dialogue throughout the quest line. Afterwards, I realized that I should have kept Shadowheart in as well to see how she'd react to everyone threatening the artifact she was keeping safe, but I didn't. I forgot. Honestly, this was such a visual relief after all that time spent in the Underdark, which I wasn't really vibing with all that much, as you may recall. It reminded me of the Dwarven ruins inhabited by the Falmer in Skyrim, which often presented its own set of nightmares. And that association wasn't doing the Underdark any favors. For the 3rd time, I approached a group that I disagreed with morally, who rightfully had their guard up, who I spared until the last possible moment, and then promptly massacred due to moral convictions and circumstances that I couldn't possibly de-escalate. The Gith leader even referenced my prior goblin massacre right before I kicked his ass.
I heard there is so much goblin blood on your hands that it soaks their children's nightmares.
The formerly peaceful Sylvanas has become infamous for his predictably patterned murder sprees. I know that these situations could have all gone differently, but I can't help but wonder if it's even possible to avoid mass violence. I'm also surprised at how these major encounters seem to have the same basic arc. Perhaps I'm the problem here because I'm reacting identically each time, but the setup is also identical each time, so of course I'll react accordingly. I'm headed into Act 2 having defied the Githyanki Queen Vlaakith by not killing my dream visitor, who Vlaakith has imprisoned within the astral plane. Sparing her turned the Githyanki against Lae'zel, who is rightfully upset, but ultimately sees that Vlaakith, despite her promises to honor Lae'zel as a chosen for her fealty, isn't operating in her best interest. Her choice was validated by another Githyanki, one we've actually met before named Supreme Kithrak Voss, who came to our camp and supported her decision, then told us to meet him in Baldur's Gate. I haven't found a cure for my brain tadpole yet, but it's not immediately turning me or my party into mind flayers like it should be doing, so there's more to discover there. I've been critical of this game, but that's only because it's so deserving of my critique. I'm by no means looking to champion a contrarian opinion. This deep dive is coming from a place of love for what's being done here. Baldur's Gate 3 is doubtlessly going to provide the foundation for future titles to raise the interactivity ceiling and hide the technical seams in revolutionary ways. The industry needs a trailblazer like this to push the needle forward, much like Elden Ring or Breath of the Wild. I can't wait to dive into Act 2 and see where this journey takes me.
So that's it. Thank you so much for watching. I super appreciate it. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, all that jazz. That really helps me out. It'll keep me motivated. I don't think the Act 2 and 3 videos are going to take as long just because I've said what I want to say from a core mechanic standpoint. Also, don't hold back with me. If you have critique or feedback or whatever, it's going to help the videos get better, and I want to know where you're feeling passionate one way or the other about things. I want you to tell me why I'm wrong. I think that's all I got to say, so goodbye.